The Ancient City, Book 4, Chapter 7. The Plebs Enter the City. 2. History of this revolution at Athens. The Eupatrids, after the overthrow of royalty, governed Athens during 4 centuries. Upon this long dominion, history is silent. We know only one fact, that it was odious to the lower orders, and that the people tried to change the government. In the year 598, the discontent which appeared general, and certain signs which showed revolution to be at hand, aroused the ambition of a Eupatrid, Coulanges, who undertook to overthrow the government of his caste and to establish himself as a popular tyrant. The energy of the archons frustrated the enterprise, but the agitation continued after him. In vain the Eupatrids employed all the resources of their religion. In vain did they announce that the gods were irritated and that specters had appeared. In vain did they purify the city from the crimes of the people and raise 2 altars to violence and insolence to appease these 2 divinities whose malign influence had agitated all minds. All this was to no purpose. The feeling of hatred was not appeased. They brought from Crete the pious Epimenides, a mysterious personage who was said to be the son of a goddess, and he performed a series of expiatory ceremonies. They hoped, by thus striking the imaginations of the people, to revive religion and consequently to fortify the aristocracy. But the people were not moved. The religion of the Eupatrids no longer had any influence upon their minds. They persisted in demanding reform. For 16 years longer, the fierce opposition of the peasants of the mountain and the patient opposition of the rich men of the shore waged war against the Eupatrids. Finally, those who were wisest among the 3 parties agreed to entrust to Solon the care of terminating the discords and of preventing still greater misfortunes. Solon had the rare fortune to belong at the same time to the Eupatrids by birth and to the merchants by the occupation of his earlier years. His poetry exhibits him to us as a man entirely free from the prejudice of caste. By his conciliatory spirit, by his taste for wealth and luxury, by his love of pleasure, he was far removed from the old Eupatrids. He belonged to new Athens. We have said above that Solon began by freeing the land from the old domination which the religion of the Eupatrid families had exercised over it. He broke the chains of clientship. So great a change in the social state brought with it another in the political order. The lower orders needed thenceforth, according to the expression of Solon himself, a shield to defend their newly found liberty. This shield was political rights. Solon's constitution is far from being well known to us. It appears, however, that all the Athenians made from that time a part of the assembly of the people, and that the Senate was no longer composed of Eupatrids alone. It appears even that the archons could be elected outside the ancient priestly caste. These grave innovations destroyed all the ancient rules of the city. The right of suffrage, magistracies, priesthood, the direction of society, all these had to be shared by the Eupatrid with the inferior caste. In the new constitution, no account was taken of the rights of primogeniture. There were still classes, but men were no longer distinguished except by wealth. The rule of the Eupatrids disappeared. The Eupatrid was no longer of any account unless he was rich. He had influence through his wealth, but not through his birth. Thenceforth the poet could say, "In poverty the noble is of no account," and the people applauded in the theater this line of the poet: "Of what rank is this man? Rich, for those are now the noble." The system which was thus founded had 2 sorts of enemies: the Eupatrids, who regretted their lost privileges, and the poor, who still suffered from the inequality of their rank. Hardly had Solon finished his work when agitation recommenced. The poor, says Plutarch, showed themselves the fierce enemies of the rich. The new government displeased them, perhaps, quite as much as that of the Eupatrids. Besides, seeing that the Eupatrids could still be archons and senators, many imagined that the revolution had not been complete. Solon had maintained the republican forms. Now the people still entertained a blind hatred against these forms of government under which they had seen, for 4 centuries, nothing but the reign of the aristocracy. After the example of many Greek cities, they wished for a tyrant. Pisistratus, a Eupatrid, but following his own personal ambition, promised the poor a division of the lands, and attached them to himself. One day he appeared in the assembly, and, pretending that he had been wounded, asked for a guard. The men of the higher classes were about to reply and unveil his falsehood, but the people were ready to resort to violence to sustain Pisistratus. The rich, seeing this, fled in disorder. Thus, one of the first acts of the popular assembly recently established was to enable a man to become master of his country. But it does not appear that the reign of Pisistratus offered any check to the development of the destinies of Athens. Its principal effect, on the contrary, was to guarantee this great social and political reform, which had just taken place, against a reaction. The Eupatrids never regained their lost power. The people showed themselves little desirous of recovering their liberty. Twice a coalition of the great and the rich overthrew Pisistratus. Twice he returned to power, and his sons governed Athens after him. The intervention of the Lacedaemonian army was required in Attica to put an end to this family's rule. The ancient aristocracy had, for a moment, the hope of profiting by the fall of Pisistratus and regaining its privileges. They not only failed of this, but received a still ruder blow. Cleisthenes, who belonged to this class, but who was of a family which it had covered with opprobrium, and had seemed to reject for 3 generations, found the surest means of taking away the little of its power that still remained. Solon, in changing the constitution, had retained the old religious organization of Athenian society. The population remained divided into 200 or 300 gentes, into 12 phratries, and 4 tribes. In each one of these groups there were, as in the preceding period, an hereditary worship, a priest, who was a Eupatrid, and a chief, who was the same as the priest. All this was a relic of the past, which disappeared slowly. Through this, the traditions, the usages, the rules, the distinctions that existed in the old social state were perpetuated. All these had been established by religion, and in their turn they maintained religion, that is to say, the power of the great families. There were in each of these organizations 2 classes of men. On the one side were the Eupatrids, who had, by right of birth, the priesthood and the authority. On the other, men of an inferior condition, who were no longer either slaves or clients, but who were still retained by religion under the authority of the Eupatrids. In vain did the laws of Solon declare that all Athenians were free. The old religion seized a man as he went out of the assembly where he had voted freely, and said to him, "Thou art bound to the Eupatrid through worship. Thou owest him respect, deference, submission. As a member of the city, Solon has freed thee, but as a member of a tribe, thou obeyest the Eupatrid. As a member of a phratry, thou also hast a Eupatrid for a chief. In the family itself, in the gens where thou wert born, and which thou canst not leave, thou still findest the authority of the Eupatrid." Of what avail was it that the political law had made a citizen of this man, if religion and manners persisted in making him a client? For several generations, it is true, many men lived outside these organizations, whether they had come from foreign countries, or had escaped from the gens and the tribe, to be free. But these men suffered in another way. They found themselves in a state of moral inferiority compared with other men, and a sort of ignominy was attached to their independence. There was, therefore, after the political reform of Solon, another reform to be made in the domain of religion. Cleisthenes accomplished it by suppressing the 4 old religious tribes, and replacing them with 10 tribes, which were divided into demes. These tribes and demes resembled in appearance the ancient tribes and gentes. In each one of these organizations, there were a worship, a priest, a judge, assemblies for religious ceremonies, and assemblies to deliberate upon the common interests. But the new groups differed from the old in 2 essential points. First, all the free men of Athens, even those who had not belonged to the old tribes and gentes, were included in the divisions of Cleisthenes. This was a great reform. It gave a worship to those who before had none, and included in a religious association those who had previously been excluded from every association. In the second place, men were distributed in the tribes and demes not according to birth, as formerly, but according to their locality. Birth was of no account, men were equal, and privileges were no longer known. The worship for which the new tribe and deme were established was no longer the hereditary worship of an ancient family. Men no longer assembled around the hearth of a Eupatrid. The tribe or deme no longer venerated an ancient Eupatrid as a divine ancestor. The tribes had new, eponymous heroes, chosen from among the ancient personages of whom the people had preserved a grateful recollection. And as for the demes, they uniformly adopted as their protecting gods Zeus the guardian of the walls and the paternal Apollo. Henceforth there was no reason why the priesthood should be hereditary in the deme, as it had been in the gens, or why the priest should always be a Eupatrid. In the new groups, the priestly office, as well as that of the chief, was annual, and every member might enjoy it in his turn. This reform completed the overthrow of the aristocracy of the Eupatrids. From this time, there was no longer a religious caste, no longer any privileges of birth, either in religion or in politics. Athenian society was completely transformed. Now the suppression of the old tribes, replaced by new ones, to which all men had access, and in which they were equal, was not a fact peculiar to the history of Athens. The same change took place at Cyrene, Sicyon, Elis, and Sparta, and probably in many other Greek cities. Of all the means calculated to weaken the ancient aristocracy, Aristotle saw none more efficacious than this. If one wished to found a democracy, he says, he would proceed as Cleisthenes did at Athens. He would establish new tribes and new phratries. For the hereditary family sacrifices, he would substitute sacrifices where all men might be admitted, and he would associate and blend the people together as much as possible, being careful to break up all interior associations. When this reform has been accomplished in all the cities, it may be said that the ancient mold of society has been broken and that a new social body has been formed. This change in the organizations which the ancient hereditary religion had established, and which it had declared immutable, marks the end of the religious government of the city.